Our next speaker for this extended session, J Budziszewski, who is the professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin, where he specializes in the areas of political philosophy, virtue ethics, and natural law theory. He is a prolific author. Perhaps some of you are familiar with his writings, as might be found periodically in First Things. He has authored at least 10 books that I'm aware of. Let me mention just a few of the titles: The Resurrection of Nature, Political Theory and Human Character; The Nearest Coast of Darkness, A Vindication of the Politics of Virtues. I love that title. Written on the Heart, The Case for Natural Law, and most recently, a book that has just recently come out, The Line Through the Heart, Natural Law as Fact, Theory, and Sign of Contradiction. The title of his talk for us this afternoon is Vicious Circles, Virtuous Circles, and Getting from One to the Other. Please join me in welcoming Professor J Budziszewski.
Thank you. I'm really glad to see all of you. This is the... Oh, my goodness, I'm too close to this. That's the problem. Is that better? No interference? A little? Well, the technical gentleman is about to try to take care of that. Maybe I should wait a moment. You can just turn off this desk mic if you want, since I'm not using it. Oh, that's a light. Well, while he's doing that, I'll tell you, I do have to, in the interest of honesty, I have to say I don't quite deserve one piece of credit that I was given. I was introduced as a professor of philosophy. I am jointly appointed in the philosophy department, but at the University of Texas, but my home-based department is actually government. They're the ones who pay me. So, okay, at least the interference isn't too bad. Shall I just begin? Okay, very good. This is not a golden age of virtue. I trust no one will be surprised by the statement. I hear a chuckle out there. There's no need to belabor the statistics on spousal betrayal, parental abandonment, pederastic seduction by ministers of religion, the willingness of ordinary people to lie and cheat. It would be fatuous to relate copious anecdotes of private vice. We've read these statistics. We've heard these anecdotes. We know all about this. We know what our times are like. We know our own temptations. As should have been expected, our public life is no more edifying than our private. The first steps have been taken toward criminalizing policy disagreements. The use of private detectives to dig up dirt on opponents no longer surprises us. Defamatory lying is so much the norm that the sharp term character assassination has lost its sting, and one can only wonder how much time will pass before its place is taken by real assassination. The idea that law might not be whatever judges say isn't even considered intelligible enough to be ridiculous. Although a few political science majors may have heard the expression rule of law, scarcely 1 in 50 has any idea what it means. Well, the conventional response to such dark murmurings is that all times think that old times were better. But I'm not so much making a comparison with old times. It was certainly true, if we want to. Some old times were much worse than ours, and perhaps all old times were worse in some ways. Even so, we could give those old times a run for their money. Part of our difficulty in seeing ourselves clearly is that we've lost the sense of what good times might be. How could the times be so bad, we ask ourselves, when our vices are so gentle, so nice? We don't herd children off to gas chambers. We only authorize their mothers to kill them in neighborhood clinics. We don't force slaves to disembowel each other in gladiatorial contests. We only encourage our young people to become slaves, buying them electronic games so that they can participate in the lust of bloodshed without actually risking themselves. We don't have a caste system. We only have hospital ethics boards to decide which lives are not worthy of life. Another conventional response to such dark murmurings is what T.S. Eliot's dead-on expression calls dreaming of systems so perfect that no one has to be good. We cheerfully call out the social engineers and we assign them the task of making virtue superfluous. The first part of this response, I think, it really has two parts. The first part of, or three, the first part of this response is to say that what matters is not character, but conduct. It doesn't matter how sordid you are inwardly so long as you behave. We might retain the word virtue, but we reinterpret it to mean mere compliance with external rules. The second part of the response is to change the rules themselves. We don't change them the same way in every domain. In some domains, especially business and financial dealings, the fashion is to make the rules even more stringent and complicated on the assumption that it's easier to get people to comply if they know exactly what is expected of them and they're very closely monitored. Oddly, in other domains, especially marriage and family and sexuality, we follow the opposite approach. The rules are relaxed or eliminated on the assumption that it's much easier to get people to comply if there isn't much to comply with anyway. The third part of the response is usually to compensate for the inevitable social consequences of the first two parts of the response. Do businessmen still break the rules? Well, then we'll make more rules and step up the monitoring. Do people have children out of wedlock? Don't expect chastity. Give them birth control pills. Do the pills alter behavior so that even more children are born out of wedlock than before? Well, don't consider the previous decision. Allow them to kill some of them. Are fathers abandoning the ones who survive? Don't compel them to live up to their responsibilities. Put the mothers on the dole, considering what sorts of fathers and husbands such men make. Mothers may even prefer such arrangements. After all, once you've infantilized men, matriarchy looks pretty good. Unfortunately, under such a regime, the mothers, too, are infantilized. So matriarchy doesn't work either. I think we all know that I'm merely illustrating. The general principle is that the effort to compensate for the consequences of a regime in which virtue is not expected inevitably begets consequences of its own. Eventually, the regime collapses under the weight of its own supposed perfections. Instead of dismissing the dark murmurings, then, let's consider what might be needed to become good. To become good, what might it take for an adult population and their rulers to become virtuous? Or at least to become more nearly virtuous than we are. Unquestionably, this is a difficult and a subtle problem. If I may make a suggestion, though, the reason that it defeats us, and it defeats thee too, may have less to do with its subtleties than with the fact that we tend to overlook some of its most obvious features. And the result is that when we do come to the subtleties, we don't ask the right questions. Perhaps then we ought to be not less obvious, but even more obvious. Let's go right down to the flannel graph level. Let's make pictures. That is flannel graph level, isn't it? It seems to me that it is. I tried to make it that. According to a certain naive but commonplace conception, adult moral development is very much like childhood moral development. How so? Well, in the first place, this view makes no distinction between passing from an unformed condition to virtue and passing from a vicious condition to virtue. To put it another way, the privation of good order in the adult soul is mistakenly seen not as the possession of a perverse order opposed to right order, but simply as the absence of order, and you just need to supply it. In the second place, this view takes development in virtue to be simple and continuous. Little by little, we simply acquire the moral order that we lack. One might even say that on this view, the topography of moral character is flat, as in Figure 1. There's no greater tendency for the soul to be in one place rather than another. We move from one condition to the next, in my diagram from left to right, and the only resistance is inertia. Well, unfortunately, this account of things is not even faithful to the moral development of children, much less adults. Its most obvious weakness is that development in virtue isn't simple and continuous. It takes effort. It takes great effort, sometimes agony. More effort somehow than we would want to call simply the effort of overcoming inertia. And it passes through stages. Now, for this reason, moral development is often pictured. I think it's one of those thought pictures that we sort of have in mind while we're talking that we don't think about, along the lines of the next figure. The conception of moral development represented in Figure 2 is also widely held then. It's a little less naive, but only a little less. What's good about it, I guess, is its recognition that the acquisition of virtue does require discipline. Not only do new habits have to be formed, but old ones need to be broken up. It's less like sliding a package along the floor where the only resistance is inertia than like climbing upstairs where besides having to overcome inertia, one also has to conquer gravity. Now, although it's more faithful to experience in these ways, Figure 2 is unsatisfactory in other ways. The image of a staircase gives the impression that whatever level of moral development we've reached, we can rest there. I can simply stand on a stair halfway up the slope. The first problem, though, is that at least most of the time it seems that in order to be retained at all, virtue has to be exercised. Moral discipline is necessary not just to climb to a higher stair, but even to keep from slipping further down. The motto, use it or lose it, seems to apply even more strongly to the development of virtue than it does to mere muscle building, or even more strongly than to, say, interdepartmental competition for university budgets. In the second place, even if there are certain resting places or local equilibrium on the upward climb, they couldn't be just anywhere, right? Otherwise, we'd be back to the level surface of Figure 1. Besides, what makes resting places possible? A resting place would be something in the nature of an equilibrium, but in a dynamical system, equilibrium doesn't just happen. What could bring it about? Could it be, for instance, brought about by a balance of opposing forces? You rest where you are because the lure of the appetites on the one hand is exactly matched by the longing for or the attraction to virtue on the other. Well, that seems precarious. Or could it be brought about by mutually reinforcing elements, where P foments Q, and in turn Q foments P? Circles of mutually reinforcing elements are so familiar that we even have names for them, like the expression vicious circles. It's curious that we don't often speak of virtuous circles. When we do speak of virtuous circles, the term often most of the time strikes us as merely a punning play on the expression vicious circles. Maybe the reason for that is that the vicious kind of circle is more common. Or perhaps the reason for it is that, being so terrible, the vicious circle etches itself more painfully on our awareness, and we remember it, and it makes a greater mark on our language. Be that as it may, both vicious circles and virtuous circles are commonplace, not only in moral life, but also in the literature of moral life. One type of vicious and virtuous circle was fundamental, for instance, not only to Aristotle's educational theory, but also to his political theory. If the young man is well formed by his parents and by his teachers and by the laws in that order, then in adulthood he himself is able to function well as a father, a teacher perhaps, and a legislator, and the cycle begins again. Each element of the circle is apparently indispensable. If the young are ill-formed by their parents, then they're ill-fit to be taught. The reason for Aristotle's famous refusal to accept students who hadn't been brought up well. If the students are ill-formed by the laws, then they're not fit to legislate. The reason for the insistence of Aristotle and his followers, including Thomas Aquinas, was the purpose of law is to make men good. Now, it may be thought that I'm cheating, and I guess I am. Instead of describing the mutual dependence of each element in the moral life on each of the others, what I've really been describing is the moving process by which each generation is formed by and dependent on the one before it. At first, the process appears to be circular, because the old form the young, who then become the old, who then form the young, who then become the old, and so on. But it's really more like a spiral, because at each turn of the axle we have a different young and a different old. I concede this point. But of course, true circles are also commonplace. Consider the complementarity of the sexes. The male and the female sorts of humanity need each other. There is a kind of incompleteness at the heart of each one, which only the other can supply. Short of the charism of celibacy, this requires a conjugal community in which the spouses support each other in their shared moral life. Now, if you can achieve that, that would be a virtuous circle. But now consider the sort of person who denies all this. Many people do. Most of our contemporaries do. Consider perhaps, for example, a young woman who's interested in men, but who's convinced that the interests of men and women are at war. I've known young women like this. Men, in her view, are by nature predatory, never to be trusted. What women want is not to form a conjugal community, but just to get married, and as lures, they dole out their favors, she may think. What men want, however, is to enjoy the favors of women without getting married, or if drawn by some mishap into marriage, to give back as little as possible. Now, such views are fundamentally false. I don't mean that they're false in the sense that there aren't any men and women who think this way. Certainly they are. But they're false in the sense that they do violence to our natures, and they are unjust, even today, to a good many women and a good many men. Unfortunately, such views also help to bring about the very state of affairs that they deplore. You can't tell predators from non-predators if you think that all men are predators. You can't live in a virtuous circle in which each successful marriage is an encouragement to all others if the specter of a true community of the spouses so fills you with resentment that you want to prove it false and tear it down. If you organize your life on the basis of the conviction that all relations between the sexes are predatory, you will end up in predatory relationships which seem to confirm your belief. You will indeed live in a circle, but the circle you live in will be vicious. How is it ever possible to break out of a vicious circle? One might suggest that perhaps the sheer unhappiness of it can provide a motive to resist. Perhaps it can. But I think not by itself, certainly not without better understanding, which was absent in my example, and certainly not without hope, which was also absent in my example. By itself, unhappiness does nothing to develop understanding. And insofar as it encourages despair, unhappiness may lead still deeper into the vicious circle. One day in class, if you teach ethical and political philosophy, inevitably, as many of you will have discovered, the topic of the sexual revolution is going to come up, whether you bring it up or not. Well, it did. I confined myself to remarking to my students that although my generation had invented this upheaval, I had the impression that their generation was paying for it. A young man raised his hand and spoke and indicated that he knew what I meant. My heart went out to him because he said that more than anything, he longed, he used the language of longing, he longed to fall in love with a woman and marry her and be faithful to her forever. But I was cast down again when he added, but I don't think it's possible. His own parents hadn't been able to manage lifelong fidelity. And in a sort of a perverse application of honor to his parents, he was unwilling to hope that he could do better than they did. He was afraid to get married at all. I don't think that he was abstaining from sexual relationships, but he certainly wanted to abstain from marriage. A certain kind of misery can even generate, not just reinforce or lead deeper into a vicious circle. I'm thinking especially of the misery, which is often, by the way, a suppressed or an unconscious misery. This is the misery of guilty knowledge. If I repent of the evil that I've done, say complicity in abortion, then I can confess my wrong, I can make the sacrifice of a broken and contrite heart, I can attempt to restore the bonds that I've broken, and I can attempt to get back into harmony with justice. But if I refuse to repent, these four needs of my soul don't vanish. I merely pay them off and try to pay them off in counterfeit coin. I confess every detail of what I did except that it was wrong. I pay every pain and every price except the one price demanded of a contrite and broken heart. I simulate the restoration of broken intimacy by enjoying the substitute intimacy, which can be very sweet, of sharing in guilt with equally guilty companions. And instead of being made just, I invent justifications. Any one of these four movements of the soul is sufficient to start up the circle, and all of them are going on at once. Acquiring a life of their own, they may even drive me into new misdeeds that it was no part of my original intention to commit. Now, in this quick run through just one hall of the gallery of vicious and virtuous circles, we've glanced at what? At the spiraling wheels of children and parents, of students and teachers, of citizens and the laws. We've considered the spinning tops of conjugal love, war of the sexes, and war against the conscience. Especially with the last of these, war against the conscience, we've begun to encroach on the sovereign territory of a third type of vicious or virtuous circle, the interior circle, the orbis cordis, in which the mutually reinforcing elements are principles in the heart of the soul itself. The most concise and systematic theorist of the interior circle is St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas observes that among the things that mutually support each other in the moral life are the virtues themselves, and I'd like to focus on that with intensity. I'm presenting only one of his arguments, which he borrows from Aristotle, but as usual puts more clearly and systematically than Aristotle himself does. The first step is to show that each of the moral virtues depend on prudence, or practical wisdom. According to St. Thomas, although the moral virtues direct us to right ends, by themselves they don't show us the right way to pursue these ends. Courage, for instance, requires enough fear to avoid being rash, enough daring to avoid being cowardly. Those are the vices opposed to courage. But how much to give fear and daring their way varies from case to case. Correct judgment requires deliberating well. It requires attaining the right judgment. It requires applying this judgment to action. These elements are supplied by prudence. In Figure 4, then, prudence is indicated by the letters PRU. Isn't that remarkable? There's no room to show each of the moral virtues. So just to make it a manageable diagram, I've only shown 6. I've sketched in courage, indicated by CRG, friendliness, that's FRN, truthfulness, TRU, liberality, LID, justice, JUS, and temperance, TMP. The next step in his argument is to show that the dependency works in the other direction too. According to St. Thomas, just as the moral virtues depend on prudence for knowledge of right means, so prudence depends on the moral virtues for direction to right ends. Were it not for the virtue of prudence, temperance would be jerked around by a riot of conflicting impulses and desires, trying to satisfy or at least conciliate them all. That's what Aristotle has in mind when he says that temperance, quote, preserves prudence. But if St. Thomas is right, then why shouldn't we say the same things about each of the moral virtues? In their own ways, don't they preserve prudence too? Consider courage. The virtue that deals with fear and daring. The prudent man has to fear error, doesn't he? Yet he also has to risk it in pursuit of right judgment. And he also has to dare the contempt of other people if they think him a fool. So courage, too, in its way, preserves prudence. Now, if the dependency between prudence and the moral virtues is really mutual, as this suggests, if it works in both directions, not just one, then a strong conclusion follows, to which we now turn. Consider any 2 moral virtues. Just to be definite, let us choose temperance and courage. Dependency is transitive, so courage depends on prudence, and prudence depends on... if courage depends on prudence and prudence depends on temperance, then courage depends on temperance. For the same reason, if temperance depends on prudence and prudence depends on courage, then temperance depends on courage. So the mutual dependency that we've already observed between moral virtue and prudence, which is an intellectual virtue, also obtains between these 2 different moral virtues, courage and temperance. Now, exactly the same thing is true of every pair of moral virtues. The conclusion is unmistakable. Every moral virtue depends on every one of the others. And that is, in fact, Thomas Aquinas' conclusion. It may seem that this result fails to follow, to mention just one of the objections that he considers. Just as one may have the art of making certain things without the art of making certain others, so one may be prudent about things to be done in relation to one virtue without being prudent about those that concern another virtue. St. Thomas replies to this objection by pointing out that the analogy between making and doing is flawed. Although things made and things are not necessarily related to each other, things done are always related to each other. Consequently, he says, the lack of prudence, of practical wisdom in one department of things to be done would result in a deficiency affecting other things to be done, whereas this doesn't occur in things to be made. Well, this interconnection of virtues has staggering consequences. Perhaps you know what happens when a bicycle tire is bent. Since all of the spokes are connected through the hub and the rim, if one is misaligned, then all of the others are also pulled out of true. And it's very difficult to get them straight again because the only way to straighten one spoke is to straighten all of them. Now, moral virtues are to the spokes of the wheel as prudence is to the hub. Thus, what happens to one is transmitted to each of the others. All of the virtues are joined, each is part of the web. A touch on any thread makes the whole web shake. And on reflection, I think that we find that this describes real life quite well. To mention but one example, as we've recently been reminded, in the state of South Carolina, a statesman who cannot keep faith with his wife is scarcely likely to be able to keep faith with his friends and constituents. It appears that the virtues are connected. Why should we ever have dreamt otherwise? In order to be deceived about the good of fidelity, a man must be deceived about a whole range of other goods. The truest friendship is partnership in a good life. Well, in that respect, his friendliness is impaired. Justice requires acute perception of what is really due to the other person. In that respect, his justice is impaired. Courage requires not merely fearlessness, but a right estimate of what things are worth fighting for. In that sense, his courage is impaired. Everything is addled. Everything is out of adjustment. Now, I don't wish this example to be misunderstood. There are a lot of good reasons not to pry into other people's marriages, and it's not my proposal that we do that. That's not the point of the comparison. I'm only suggesting that the silly notion that all of the virtues are disconnected, that they can thrive totally independently from each other, is not one of those reasons. We may also concede that it's true that just as one bicycle spoke may be more bent than another, or less bent than another, just as a man's heart might work better than his lungs, so we might approach more nearly to true virtue in one dimension than another. Thomas Aquinas is realistic about this fact, in contrast, for example, with Socrates, who thought that in the last analysis there's really only one virtue, wisdom. But even Socrates wasn't wholly wrong, he only exaggerated. If we are flawed in one way, it is true, apparently, that we are flawed to some degree in all ways. I think I'm on the wrong, no? I don't know. St. Thomas restricts his argument about the connectedness of the virtues to what he calls perfect virtues. In the case of an imperfect virtue, I have an inclination to do the kind of deed in question, but I'm not guided by prudence. So I may not do it at the right time or in the right way. By contrast, in the case of a perfect virtue, both sides of the mutual dependency do their part. Virtue directs us rightly to our ends, and prudence directs us rightly to the means, so that we not only do the kind of deed in question, but we do it well. Now, as we've seen, perfect virtues are connected with each other by way of their shared connection with prudence. According to the angelic doctor, however, imperfect virtues are not connected at all. Only perfect virtues are. He gives as the reason, since we find men who by natural temperament or by being accustomed are prompt in doing deeds of liberality, but are not prompt in doing deeds of chastity. Now, the upshot is that the picture that St. Thomas presents, at any rate in this passage, is static. It describes the equilibrium of a man of perfect virtue, in whom each moral disposition supports each of the others, but it has nothing to say about the dynamics of disequilibrium, of moral decay or development in those who are flawed. In fact, from the point of view that the angelic doctor seems to be developing in this place, in relation to flawed people, even the term disequilibrium that I'm using is a little too strong. If morally imperfect dispositions really are disconnected from each other, then they can have no dynamic relationships at all, right? But is what we just said true? Doesn't an argument quite similar to Thomas Aquinas' apply to imperfect people too? Granted that in a state of perfection, virtue supplies the ends and prudence supplies the means. Granted, too, that outside of perfection, the fullness of prudence is lacking. But surely that isn't the end of the story. The flawed man probably lacks other things, too. And he probably possesses other things that take their place. In the first place, flawed affective dispositions take the place of virtue by supplying distorted images of the ends that are to be sought. For example, even though I know that friendship is good, I might have a muddled notion of what friendship really is. In the second place, no one acts without any reflection or understanding or judgment whatsoever. Even a flawed man relies on some sort of an understanding, which takes the place of prudence by supplying disordered means. For example, I may think that I can secure friends by bribing or threatening them. It seems to follow that just as prudence and true moral virtues depend on each other in one way, flawed understanding and flawed affective dispositions depend on each other in another way, and in fact, probably they depend on each other in two ways. Not only does each supply something to the other, images of the ends and ideas of the means, but they also reinforce each other dynamically. Our muddled notions of ends and means prop each other up. But if all this is true, then the affective dispositions of flawed people are connected after all. Just as true moral virtues are connected with each other by means of prudence, so flawed moral dispositions are connected with each other by means of flawed understanding. Figure 9 tells the story by using the letter U to indicate understanding and the letters AD to indicate various affective dispositions. Now, our new conclusion doesn't require believing that flawed people have to be equally flawed in every dimension. To reiterate St. Thomas's example, we should still expect to, quote, find men who are prompt in doing deeds of liberality, but not prompt in doing deeds of chastity. I like that expression, by the way, deeds of chastity. We think of chastity as abstention from deeds, but he thinks of this as something positive. Even so, what happens in any dimension has consequences for all of the others. Not only in a state of perfect virtue, but all the way down to vice. The picture is no longer static, it's dynamical. But what kinds of consequences, back to the flannel graph, do the events in one dimension have for all of the others? Even the static analysis that we started with showed that for one virtue to be perfect, all the other virtues would have to be perfect too. If we're flawed in one way, we're flawed to some degree in all ways. Inevitably, it might seem then that the proper way to dynamicize this insight would be to say that at any stage of moral development, injury in any dimension of virtue is a drag on the whole moral organism. Yes, your heart may be working better than your lungs, but the worse off your heart is, the worse off your lungs will be. Each flaw generates other flaws, which generate other flaws, which generate other flaws, and so on down the line. We might wonder about such an analogy. You know, it is said, for instance, that people suffering consumption have a rosy disposition that looks like health. Is the relationship paradoxical in the case of virtue too? But we'll come back to that. In any case, according to this picture that we've got so far, there are only two moral equilibria. One of the moral equilibria is perfect virtue. The other is perfect ruin. Now, what that diagram fails to highlight is that although our system does have two equilibria, only one of those equilibria is stable. Equilibrium and stability, after all, are not the same thing. A marble in a bowl is in stable equilibrium. If I nudge it with my finger, it tends to settle back down to the bottom, doesn't it? But by contrast, a house of cards is in unstable equilibrium. It is an equilibrium. There's a balance of opposing forces, and it's just sitting there. But if I nudge it with my finger, it doesn't come back into shape. It doesn't tend to restore itself after that disturbance. Rather, it loses its equilibrium and collapses. When I say then that the system has two equilibria but only one is stable, I mean that vice is like the marble in the bowl, but virtue, according to that picture, is like the house of cards. Figure 12 labels these two equilibria more exactly. The moment you depart from virtue, you're on the way to vice. Perhaps adventitious forces could arrest your decline, but nothing inherent to the process on this picture could do so. You better be wholly good, or you'll probably end up wholly bad. Is this view of things accurate? Well, there's certainly something in the common sense of ordinary people that supports such a view. Although we do find virtue attractive, we also somehow resent virtue, don't we? And each of us has experienced the gravitational force of sin. Commonly, we also recognize a point of no return, beyond which the bad get worse and worse. I hinted at this earlier when I remarked that despair and bad conscience not only generate vicious circles, but can quote-unquote drive us deeper into them. Deeper, that is, into vice. In one of G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown stories, he has the hero remark, I quote, "Men may keep a sort of level of good, but no man has ever been able to keep on one level of evil. That road goes down and down." Well, figure 12 makes the road down and down plain enough. The problem with figure 12 is that it doesn't do justice to the other part of Chesterton's statement. It reflects one part but not the other. It shows why no man can keep on one level of evil, but it doesn't show how anyone can hold a sort of level of good. It leads us to expect that although now and then you might by chance come across a case of virtue, like you might by chance every now and then come across a house of cards, but it'll never last long. Surely that's extreme. We do meet people of apparently stable good character. Virtue may be rare, but it's more than a will-o'-the-wisp. It may not be made of adamant, but it is surely more durable than sea foam. But perhaps we haven't done justice to the view of St. Thomas and Aristotle, after all, in calling it static. Consider again Aristotle's remark that temperance preserves prudence. He says that pleasures and pains destroy and pervert correct beliefs about what is to be done. He goes on to say that the man who's been ruined in this way fails to see even the quote-unquote principles of the virtues. In other words, he lacks an accurate perception not only of right means, but even of right ends. By steeling him against pleasures and pains, temperance keeps this from happening. St. Thomas says much the same thing, holding that temperance, quote, withdraws man from things which seduce the appetite from obeying reason, while fortitude incites him to endure or withstand those things on account of which he might forsake the good of reason. These certainly sound like dynamical claims. Moreover, they suggest that up to a point, the equilibrium of the virtuous man does have some tendency to maintain itself against disturbance, that virtue maybe is not a house of cards after all. So we might not need to give up the idea of a point of no return. What we do need to give up is the idea that the point of no return is only infinitesimally different from the point of perfection. Perhaps then the dynamical landscape of virtue is more faithfully reflected by figure 13. The virtuous man enjoys a little well of stability. He has attained that state of character in which it's actually easier for him to act virtuously than not to do so. He's not clinging desperately to the slope, a glassy surface in which his fingernails can't even dig in, suffering all kinds of wrong desires and at best suppressing them. By and large, he even desires what he ought to desire. I think figure 13 is still deficient. The little well of stability, the local equilibrium that the virtuous man enjoys is not the only such well. In fact, as in figure 14, there are local equilibria of the most diverse and surprising kinds all the way down the slope. I call to my witness St. Augustine of Hippo. I learned this morning in another talk that this is his what? I can't remember how many years, but this is his birthday. He saw this most clearly. Reflecting on the history of Rome, Augustine explained how the love of glory, which is in reality a vice, could so closely imitate a virtue that the Romans thought it really was one. The reason that he could do this is that although I may have all sorts of corrupt desires, my love of glory may be stronger still. For the sake of being admired by others, I suppress all those other desires, and I perform seemingly public-spirited deeds in the public square. The underlying idea is that sub-virtuous motives, how sub-virtuous? I'm using a term that's open on that question, may be channeled and directed so that they give rise to some of the behavior to which virtue itself would have given rise, would have produced. Wonder of wonders, then somewhere down the slope, the slide to the bottom seems to be arrested. Maybe, whoops, I'm punching the wrong thing. Let's see. Maybe here, maybe here. But you're not at the bottom, and you're not sliding. In principle, not only the love of glory, but almost any sub-virtuous motive might be channeled and exploited in this way. The process is apparently so powerful and so flexible that in Augustine's view, what grounds a given commonwealth, these are not words of praise, by the way, but only words of description, is not that the citizens share a sense of justice, as Cicero's Scipio thought, for Augustine thinks that no commonwealth is wholly just, but only that they agree about the objects of their love. Each love tends to generate its own local equilibrium. We find such local equilibria all the way down the slope. They may be very far down indeed. In the 20th and 21st centuries, disastrous attempts, don't we all know, have been made to put even envy, fear, and hatred into harness for some conception of the good. Vice puts on the clothing of virtue in pettier and more personal ways as well. How often we see that the need to condescend, the craving to feel virtuous, different than the longing to be virtuous, or even the urge to atone, may ape true compassion for the weak and misused. But then again, perhaps these masquerades are not so petty, so insignificant after all. They seem to account for a large part of the character and motivations of our present ruling class. Anyway, once we peer through the Augustinian eyepiece, we find numerous examples of subvirtuous local equilibrium, some of them higher up and some of them lower. I'll mention just a few. Augustine himself suggests that in an earlier stage of Rome's history, the shared love that united the citizens and kept their baser loves in check was the love of independence, not the love of glory. The love of independence, of self-rule, of being their own masters. Although no more a virtue than the sheer love of glory is, the love of independence imitates a virtue, pretends to be a virtue, simulates a virtue well enough to have fooled a number of the founders of our own republic too. Alexander Hamilton seemed to think that it was virtue, and he thought this love strongest in the business classes, so he pinned his political hopes on the leadership of gentlemen. That's why he thought that they were most virtuous. Thomas Jefferson thought that this love, which he thought was a virtue, was stronger in the farming classes, and so he pinned his political hopes on the sons of the earth. Aristotle had a surprisingly high view of the possibilities, not of a shared love of glory, not of a shared love of independence, but of a shared love of security. For in a regime, a mixed and balanced regime, a polity, in which both the few and the many have some part in ruling, the love of security is exactly what motivates the middle-class citizens to preserve the balance of power, imitating virtue that they don't possess. Bernard Mandeville, Adam Smith, Alexis de Tocqueville famously argued that subvirtuous local equilibrium, I can't even say my own phrase, can be, that's a sort of a rule of scholarship. Never invent a technical term that you can't reliably repeat. But I violated that rule. They argued famously that it can be grounded in another shared love, the desire for material comfort and gain. James Madison argued that it can be grounded in shared love of eminence, and as he put it in Federalist number 51, pitting ambition against ambition. The achievement of sub-virtuous local equilibrium always has both institutional and moral requirements, though. How so? First, let's consider its institutional requirements. The setting for Augustine's discussion of the love of glory, imitating virtue, is a society of fixed statuses because only a nobility is sufficiently interested in glory for this to work. We also need an arena of competition, a setting in which glory can be won. Curiously, the setting for Tocqueville's discussion of the shared love of not glory but material comfort, imitating virtue, is a society not with fixed statuses, but without it. Because only people who are unsure of their position, he emphasizes, are sufficiently interested in gain. On the other hand, as Adam Smith emphasizes, they too require an arena of competition, a setting in which gain can be won. So much for the institutional requirements. The moral requirements for subvirtuous equilibrium, I think, are more interesting because they reveal a paradox. We might have thought that these strategies for putting baser motives into harness for the good make true virtue unnecessary. After all, they do seem to get people to perform good deeds. And they do arrest the slide down the slope. Well, this turns out to be false, or at least exaggerated. Far from offering substitutes for virtue, these strategies strongly rely on what little bits of virtue still exist. What they do then is stretch these little bits so that we get more bang for the buck. They're like hamburger helper. It isn't enough for Augustinian nobles to love glory, for instance. They must also have a sense of what truly merits glory, because otherwise they will seek glory not by performing good deeds, but by buying votes and poisoning their opponents, which is what what Augustine says eventually happened. It isn't enough for Smithian entrepreneurs to love gain. They must also have a sense of restraint, as Smith himself emphasizes, because otherwise they will seek tariffs, monopolies, and privileges that destroy the so-called invisible hand. It isn't enough for Tocquevillian citizens to love material comfort. They must accept the notion of self-interest rightly understood, as Tocqueville calls it. Otherwise, they'll step on the faces of their fellows in order to be more comfortable. Now comes a point that only Augustine among these notables perceived. As we've seen, he wasn't the only theorist to see that even strategies for using bad motives to keep down worse motives rely on vestiges of good motives. So far as I know, though, he was the only one to perceive that by using these strategies, little by little, we destroy those vestiges of good motives. So that ultimately the strategies collapse. It's as though I tried to control my love of alcohol by promising myself an extra drink for not drinking too much. I undermine that very vestige of virtue that I seem to be stretching. I saw off the limb that I'm sitting on. For a while, Roman nobles did seek glory by deeds of conspicuous merit. But this way of getting them to do good deeds so inflamed the lust for glory itself that in time they were just as pleased to win it by deeds of conspicuous crime. In Augustine's view, this is the true explanation of why the love of glory finally lost its power to enchant the baser loves and was replaced by love of wealth and power. A calamity that before him solaced in Cicero, for all that they deplored it, were at a loss to understand. Presumably something of the same sort had happened earlier in Roman history, when the love of self-rule, of independence, of liberty in that sense, lost its power to enchant the baser loves and was replaced by the love of glory. Earlier I offered the image of a marble resting in a bowl. But suppose the marble rests not in a bowl, but in a bowl-shaped depression in a dry lump of slowly rising dough. No, I didn't do a flannel graph picture of that. I couldn't quite figure it out. But just as in the bowl, if I nudge the marble with my finger, it is going to settle back into the bottom of the dry depression in the lump of dough. But as the dough continues to rise, the depression becomes shallower and shallower, finally turning into a little mound. Deprived of its home, the marble rolls right off of the dough. There was a place for it to rest, but the system has changed and the resting place is no longer there. The equilibrium was stable locally while it lasted, but it didn't last. In the language of dynamical systems, it was structurally unstable. Generalizing Augustine's insight, we may say that although locally stable sub-virtuous equilibria do exist, lots of them, depending on what happens to move us most strongly, depending on what we love, they are not structurally stable. Perhaps in the long run, perhaps in the short, but inevitably they undermine themselves, they crumble, they poison their own wells. They can't help it because they all have the same fatal weakness. He who trains dragons to keep wolves under control must reward the dragons with food, and eventually the dragons grow large enough to get their own food. At this point they set aside their training and they do as they please, perhaps teaming up with the wolves. The theme of this conference is the summons of freedom, virtue, sacrifice, and the common good. This theme might remind us of the ancient idea that the willingness of a free society to sacrifice for the common good depends on virtue. Being a Thomist, I think that this would be true for a society that fully grasps the meaning of the common good, so that it loves the right things in the right ways. But I'm enough of an Augustinian to think that existing societies never do. In place of the common good, they set various motives and various loves that seem to resemble the true good. Some of these resemblances are close, and that's an encouragement. Others dreadfully far. But they're all imitations. None of these societies inhabit the local, structurally stable equilibrium, which quietly rests at the top of the landscape of virtue. Instead, they inhabit various sub-virtuous, locally stable, but structurally unstable equilibria Little cup-shaped terraces carved at various altitudes all down the side of the mountain. If this is true, then it throws a different light on the quest to mount further up the hill. The way that we make progress toward virtue as a society, if we do, is probably not much like scrambling up a smooth, glassy ramp. For what would we hold on to? For real human beings, the ascent is probably more like standing on a ledge, carved into a mountain, trying to pull ourselves onto the next higher ledge before the one that we're standing on crumbles from beneath our feet. How is this done? I think we know something of the ways to make the little ledge that we're standing on crumble even more quickly than before. Consider, for example, the cascade of destabilizing moral and social consequences that followed from the invention of the pill, which I mentioned before. But how does one reach the next higher level and pull oneself up? How does one reach the next higher ledge, grasp, hold? Apart from supernatural grace, I can't see how it would be possible at all. We know that we must cooperate with grace. We know something of what cooperation with grace means in the context of an individual life. We know something of what it means in the context of primary associations, such as families. What does it mean at the level of secondary associations, partnerships of partnerships, associations of associations, whole societies? Can a culture be repaired or reformed, or how does a new culture grow up in the cracks of the old? I crave your charity because I don't know the answer. It's taken me all my allotted time to frame the question. Thank you.
We've got 20 minutes for Q&A. I would just ask that you step forward to one of the microphones, introduce yourself, and please refrain from making a manifesto and instead offer a question, and that way we'll get
more questions.
A number of questions.
Thank you.
Heard. Please.
Parker Labbard from Notre Dame here. I'm wondering if you had thought about incorporating into your model some of the insights that come from ascetical and mystical theology. For example, with St. Teresa of Avila, etc. But this move from vice to virtue, where, for example, you move first from combating and dealing with mortal sin, which has its own particular struggles, to a state more where you're still fighting vice, but vice in terms of venial sin, which is a lesser struggle and probably still perhaps slightly structurally unstable, but more structurally stable than a state of mortal sin.
I am interested in that. I would be open to doing so. I haven't read enough about mystical and ascetical theology, and don't understand well enough what I have read to be in a position to do that yet. I'd like to. Is it your view that that might have relevance, though, not only to the ascent of the individual soul, but also possibly to the culture?
I think, yeah, inevitably that would be. What is true for the individual would also be true for.
Well, now, it's an interesting question. That might be true. It seems that if everybody in the culture was transformed, it's hard to imagine how the culture itself would not be transformed. On the other hand, if a certain subgroup of the people are transformed, one can imagine settings in which that might only enrage the remaining ones, right, and drive them to further wickedness. So I don't know that what's true of the individual would follow. It's one of the things that I would like to investigate. There's also something that St. John of the Cross describes, and I can't say that I understand this. Perhaps some of you here will, but sort of a process in which, in the attempt to experience purgation, to submit oneself to the cleansing grace of God, there comes a point where all of the submerged sins seem to bubble up to the surface like a log placed in the fire, and all that nasty sap comes spitting up to the top. That would be a paradox of the moral life, and I see some comparisons here. If you depend on some dominant love, base, not a virtue, if you depend on some dominant love to hold down still baser loves, and then in the interest of purification you mortify that love, well, then what happens to that equilibration strategy that you were depending on that keeps those still baser loves in check? You might, on the way to becoming better, seem for a time to become worse. And So I anticipate problems like that ahead if I take your suggestion, but that's not a rejection of the suggestion. I would like to do that.
Hi, my name is Jason Baxter, also associated with Notre Dame. And I appreciate your remarks about how you see students that you teach who have a certain longing for virtue. I can see it in myself and also in my students. But I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about, say, previous generations? I look at, say, my grandparents' generation and have a lot of admiration for them. But it seems that there's a certain sort of civic pride, maybe virtue without love, virtue without charity, which it seems that my parents' generation responded to mainly out of a sense of boredom. So I was wondering if virtue, and being a conservative, I think about this a lot. I just wonder if sometimes if conservatives put themselves in a dangerous position by making our ultimate aspiration virtue. If virtue itself is, if there's maybe a little pocket at the top, using your analogy of virtue, if that will inevitably rise without some sort of higher power to reward the virtue. If goodness in itself is just boring in a way, it seems that a lot of people would suggest that with our sort of caricatures of the 50s and, you know, happy mom and happy two kids and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, my sense of this is that goodness isn't actually boring. It's vice that's boring in 1,000 ways. Boring and distressing, and unless one is excited by the variety of different miseries that one experiences. And that can happen, actually. I sometimes think with my students that is what they're seeking. At first, when you were speaking, I thought you were going in a slightly different direction, and I was going to suggest that in our grandparents' generation, it wasn't so much a contrast. In some ways, we are inferior, plainly, but in some ways, one wants to say that it looks like it's a comparison between two different sub-virtuous equilibria. Sometimes, for instance, I remember my mother talking about the sense of inhibition from certain forms of behavioral experimentation in her girlhood, because people who engaged in them were considered fast, you know, and not good people. They were held in contempt, even by their peers. Now, that's going to require a community to support that judgment. But it's not the virtue of charity, right? It's retaining in certain good behavior. It's sticking to certain good behaviors, not because of a love of good and not because of purity, but because you don't want to be on the condemned side of the stick, and would rather consider yourself righteous. So there's a kind of a pride in that. So I don't know. Maybe that was part of what you were aiming at too.
Well, I mean, maybe my question could be a subcategory of Parker's question.
Mm-hmm.
If we're just setting a dangerous goal for ourselves of trying to resurrect a kind of classical pagan virtue.
Oh yeah, but I'm not suggesting.
We want our marble statues back.
Yeah, I understand now. Yeah, well, I think part of the point of what I'm saying here is that that can be the classical pagan virtue has any society ever occupied, any human society since the fall ever occupied that cup-shaped depression at the top? I don't think so. And some of the things that we idealize and treat as systems of virtue were really sub-virtuous equilibria that had their own nasty and ugly features. Now, I don't think that means, though, that it's a dangerous aspiration to try to climb ourselves and to help our fellow citizens higher up the slope. I think we have to be realistic, though, and be aware of the danger of imagining that our motives are motivated more greatly by purity and by charity that they are, rather than by the baser loves that in every one of us like to disguise themselves.
Ron Belgau from St. Louis University and here at Notre Dame for a year on fellowship. Your discussion focused almost entirely until the very end on what Aquinas would have described as the acquired virtues, with prudence as the center.
Mm-hmm.
But the vast majority of the treatise on the virtues is about the infused virtues that come through grace, through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, with charity as their center. And it seems like you sort of gestured at that towards the end, but you didn't really try to bring out the whole structure of that picture of the virtues in the way that you did with the virtues centered around prudence.
Yes, I think you're right. I didn't. And that was partly because it was too much to bite off for one presentation. Also partly because there are aspects of that that I think that I have hardly begun or not even begun to think about. I do think that Thomas Aquinas believes that the spiritual virtues are, the supernatural virtues, the infused virtues are dependent on one another in the same way that the natural virtues are. And it's also interesting that sometimes in some discussions of the relationship between the natural virtues and the supernatural virtues, Thomas Aquinas' view is misrepresented as though without grace you can attain to the perfection of the natural virtues, and then you only need grace to attain the supernatural virtues. But in fact, that's not his view at all. He thinks that that grace is necessary not only to attain the supernatural virtues, but even for the perfection of the natural virtues. You know, calling them natural doesn't mean what we sometimes take it to mean. So in a more complete analysis, that's one of the things that we would have to talk about. The other is this. Grace seems to operate in the first place on the heart of the individual person. It doesn't. It is only through persons that it operates on the society. It is not the society that's made in the image of God. You know, it is we ourselves. And so, and that experience is dependent on things that are not naturally shared among human beings. Supernatural grace is something superadded, which takes us beyond our natural capacities. So how does that work in the case of a whole society? It seems that it does something. For instance, the Christian insight that marriage not only has the natural goals of procreation and procreative unity between the spouses, but that it serves the still greater goal of allowing the conjugal community to participate in the same love that binds Christ with the church. That insight transformed Western society. And even now, 3 generations after the sexual revolution, 2 generations after pop culture nihilism, even now, traces of that remain. People want sex to mean something. Even people who would reject our understanding of the natural ends, of the natural purposes of the sexual powers, the procreative and the unitive purposes, still want, there's a sort of a hunger for what is a revealed truth there about its supernatural purpose. So there has got to be some way in which all those things are true and have to be explored too. But I confess that I haven't done it in this talk.
David Forte, Cleveland State University. The Sisyphus-like slope that you have, put in mind of Buster Keaton trying to climb some stairs that keep collapsing on him. Mm-hmm. And your turn at the end from Thomas to Augustine made me think that, in fact, life, except for those who reach it through this saving grace, falls down into this vicious stability. And so, at the end, what seems to be your picture is Calvinist, neither Thomistic nor Augustinian, but the depraved nature of man who is hopeless in his attempt to obtain virtue except through the heroic grace that God can give him. And so please, go ahead.
Well, I think if it was a Calvinist picture, I would have stopped with either the picture where you've got this slope at the point at the top and smooth glassy sides, or else I would have stopped, with the one that looks like this, which Calvin even might have accepted. I don't think that you slide all the way to the bottom. I think you're at great risk of that. We find in human history, though, that societies have existed at all sorts of different levels of goodness or of vice. I want us to be brutally honest about the fact that many of the things that we call good are very imperfectly good, that they are imitations, some of them better than others, of true goods, but always to some degree distorted. But I think that's different from total depravity. If one, there might also, I think it also might be necessary to distinguish between two different senses of the word depravity. If or of total depravity. If in saying that, if in calling our situation totally depraved without grace, one means that one cannot attain grace, one cannot attain any good, or even any simulacrum of virtue, or experience any of the goods of, the procreative good or the good of friendship or something like that, that seems to be clearly false. But on the other hand, if by total one means, and that's what many Calvinists have thought, it's not clear to me whether it's what Calvin himself thought. If, on the other hand, by total one means merely that in every one of the dimensions of human goodness, we have been injured by the fall, not completely injured to the point, to the point of death, but injured, that if total means merely there's not one dimension that's been untouched, I think that that's true, but I think that that's also Augustine's view. I think that that's also St. Paul's view. I think that that's also even Thomas Aquinas' view. Remember, he says even the perfection of natural virtue is impossible without grace.
I'm going to go over here because you were waiting before you sat down, and then we'll go over to this side.
Thank you. I'm Corinna Delkes-Campes, International Studies, Philosophy and Medicine. I come from Germany, but that's not so important here. I want to come back to what the very first person asked you, because, again...
About ascetical theology?
That's right. You do gesture in the end to grace, and you
Yes.
admit that grace is very central. So my question is, why not start and focus on that which is essential? Now, in that literature to which this gentleman referred, I would like to just add some little pictures. One is this very steep mountain, and not like with a step which crumbles when you stand, but what the ascetical fathers always emphasize, as long as you don't go up, you go down. So there is no place where you can stand at all but being safe. It's a rough thing. The second picture, which was, I think, lacking in German, is going like this. Stand up, fall down, stand up, fall down, and be sure that death hits you while you're up. I mean, it was... it is the robber on the cross who made
Yes.
it first into paradise, not the virtuous person. Now that brings me to the third thing. I think in this ascetical literature, humility and pride are really the central thing. And once one understands that the whole development of virtue hinges on humility, then one realizes that the whole business is not about, of a Christian life is not about morality, about sanctification. But then your whole problem, which you placed very relevantly for this conference, if what works for the individual, how does it get into society? I think as Christians we have to be a little bit modest. It gets into marriage, it gets into family, it gets into the church. That's what we can do. Now that was not a question, that was a provocation, and now I want a refutation.
Well, you provoked me in so many ways. But I'm stimulated to say too many different things. I think I really agree with all of that. As to whether one should start a presentation like this, start an analysis like this, at the end of supernatural grace. Well, that's a good question, and I think that may as a matter of fact, I could have gotten away with that in this audience. I'm so used to teaching in a secular environment that, and in trying to explain things from the viewpoint of the natural law rather than the divine law, from what Russell Hittinger has called the first grace of nature, rather than the grace that comes afterward, by which we are saved and sanctified. That I find it often more useful to begin at the other end. But I don't think that it's a one-size-fits-all argument. It's a rhetorical decision depending on the needs of the audience that one is speaking to, whether you're going to start at one. Both ends are valid, and to complete the picture, you've got to put them both in there. And it's absolutely true that this end of the picture I didn't fill in. which is really much more important to me. It's and I hope. All, even for our nature, even for salvation, and we have to live in that humility.
One of my hopes in talking about the difficulty of this is, in fact, to foment that, to foment and reinforce and encourage us in that humility. Thank you.
David Thunder, teaching at Villanova University.
Uh-huh.
My question has to do with grace,
yes.
Again. And you mentioned that in order to advance as a society, to move up this sort of uneven slope and to the next stable equilibrium, that you need grace, that it cannot be simply a matter of natural goodness, but you need grace. Grace is a gift, obviously. It's a gift from God. And so the difficulty for me is, what's the practical implication of this view exactly? As a society, we strive for the common good. We work alongside all people of goodwill, hopefully, including non-believers, in trying to advance the vision of the common good and in trying to improve our society. Now, if the only way in which we can progress morally is by the grace of God, then the question, which is a pure gift, the question naturally arises, what are we to do? What is it that we are supposed to do in order to improve our society? Is there a practical some kind of a practical ethic, some sort of is there something you can prescribe in terms of general principles that we can share and we can share with other people? Because if we just say wait for grace, then from a policy perspective and so on, it just seems kind of, you're just looking, waiting. I'm being a bit facetious here, obviously, to sort of prompt you to ask, to consider just what does this mean in terms of moving forward as a society, what we should do, what we ought to do.
Well, I wish I had a better answer to that question than I do. That's why I ended with that same question, and that's why at the end I confessed that I didn't have the answer to it and begged your charity. After all of this work, I think I have a better idea how to frame the question, and I would frame it very much as you do. That's very far short of having an answer to it. Now, there's also a difference in two other things. What can we say as individual Christians? Well, we need to cooperate with God's grace. We need to submit ourselves to His healing mercies. We need to do that not only individually, but in our families and in our other forms of association and in the church. Is that all that we can do? Is that all that we can do? I don't think so. I don't think it is all that we can do. I think that it is not senseless or futile or unintelligent or somehow contrary to our understanding of God's grace to say that we have to go into the public square and even engage, testify before Congress as to why partial birth abortion shouldn't be legal or something like this, and make arguments that appeal even to natural reason. Although I notice that even the attempts to appeal to natural reason usually are leavened by grace. You think of an earlier struggle in the United States, which we were encouraged to think about last night. Martin Luther King and the entire civil rights movement. Martin Luther King didn't simply appeal to people in terms of natural reason. He wasn't speaking like a Rawlsian would. He was appealing to principles of natural justice, but he leavened this with the story of God's people escaping oppression. He was not unwilling to quote the biblical insight that man is made in the image of God, and so I don't think that speaking to our non-believing neighbors means that we must never speak to them of grace, even if they don't yet accept it. There seems to be some resonance, some echo. A person who does not accept revelation may still hear the insight of revelation that we are made in the image of God, and something resonates there. It makes sense for him. It even almost feels like a secular insight for him because it makes sense of his sense of horror at the needless destruction of innocent lives. It makes sense of the dim reverence that still clings to human life, even in the non-believing world. We can appeal to this. And I think that we have to be willing to do that. One of the problems, this is a problem with our philosophical method too. Sometimes we assume that the right approach to take is minimalist because people don't want to believe anything. Give them the least little bit. But that's not how does a cook prepare food? You don't give them the fewest number of ingredients, no salt, no pepper, just some protein and no fiber. You have to give people more. Otherwise, it's just a bitter pill that doesn't want to go down. And logically, why shouldn't that ought to make sense to us? Often, a naked premise is not apparent to us in its full plausibility, its full reasonability, until we see the other premises and the other insights that mutually support it, like the capstone in an arch. It's supported by the others. So I think that we have to be willing to speak of these things in careful ways to even of our faith, even of grace, to those who still reject grace, and I think that there's a place for that in the public square. One of the reasons why I want to investigate this and at least pose the question right is so that I can go after questions like that, which are the questions that all of us have, more effectively than otherwise.
I'd like to ask for your patience. I'd like to acknowledge your question. You've been waiting so long, so please go ahead and we'll make this the last question.
Pat Fagan from Family Research Council in Washington. Everything seems to beckon. You, at the end, flagged the next, which is essentially the Christian view, and Christ himself right at the center, because civilization has changed radically with the coming of Christ and those who built a civilization around him. And to abstract purely philosophically away from that essentially leads one to a constantly frustrating end, which I suspect is what's the way many of the reactions were, and even your own reaction to where you went. I would posit that you're in a very good position, both from what you're promising to do or what's beckoning you, to look at the sociological data, which I spent some time doing, but it is amazing in this country from federal surveys, where you can see what, with a little bit of development, I think people would call virtuous actions. And you can see the outcomes, and the greater virtue among Americans, the closer they are to God. Now, how can you say federal surveys show that? They don't. But they have very gross proxies, which is how frequently they worship, how frequently they pray. So that I think you're poised, I think the whole academic community is poised, to make a massive leap forward in a very daring way and to pose to America, which is not essentially hostile to this, and I think actually at this stage rather hungry for it. Look, there's a huge amount more beckoning us, and we've learned a lot. And just look at the sort of people we are and how we do in certain ways. You see where I'm going. So.
No, I do, and I commend you, as a matter of fact, because you are one of those who's assembled these sorts of statistics and findings and worked very hard to make them more publicly known. I know some areas of this myself, not from my own research. I'm not a sociologist, but a friend of mine who's a sociologist of the family showed me just a sort of a collation of findings, and I came to realize that there's been a revolution in the sociology of the family. 2 generations ago, maybe one would say 1.5 generations ago, a revolution took place, and people said, what our great-great-great-grandparents believed was all wrong. Kids can grow up just as well with only one parent. Divorce doesn't hurt kids. A child doesn't need a dad, in the home. And it's so on and so on and so on and so on. And the sociological research of that time seemed to support them. But they were small-scale studies. They weren't longitudinal. They had very poor statistical tests. And that turns out all to be wrong. There's a new wave of research. It's overwhelming. Even some of those who were involved in that earlier research, and even including some who, to my knowledge, are not believers, have concluded that they were wrong, and that what our great-grandparents told us was in fact right after all. Is that enough to convince people? Not enough, but does it support a case? Yeah, sure it does. And one should use it. So what one needs is, okay, you need better philosophical analysis. You need a better theological understanding. You need a renovated sociology. You need a renovated political science. You need a new kind of civic rhetoric by which at least we might barely try to touch the hem of Jesus' garments. And that's my generation has pretty well dropped that ball. But I hope the next generation does better at it.